So for the listener who is not visualizing this, this is the Chinese finger trap, as you mentioned. And number one, my cats are obsessed with it. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it's fascinating. I have at least 4 different colors, just so you know. And the reason I bought it is to represent or to try to better teach the sort of like, because in school I always had trouble like actually visualizing what a muscle fiber was doing when it was contracting. And you know, I know you have dove into Bill Hartman's model a lot, but he talks a lot about the sort of helical structure of motion all the way down to the sort of fundamental unit of motion, which is, you could say is contraction. Even the structure of bone, I believe, is oriented in this sort of double helical sort of way. So anyway, this is just to represent a muscle fiber and the way that it sort of contracts in tension, right? Because it's kind of, we've had that conversation before of it being a little bit weird to visualize like tension being created because a muscle fiber like contracts with the actin and myosin and it sort of pulls itself inward. So it's like the tension based force is an outward, pulling force. And I think this is a really good way to sort of visualize how things get sort of like longer and more narrow as they contract, and then they get sort of more bulbous and a little bit thicker when they contract in a shortened way. So this would be, both being contraction. But I also think it's a good representation of like why we tend to get weak in short positions too, right? Because you see when you pull this thing really, really long, all of the fibers sort of move more in line with the plane of the whole thing. And then as it sort of bulges up, they actually start to move more perpendicular to that direction. Can you kind of visualize that? So it's cool. It's a cool representation of how tension in that shorter position actually moves away from the plane, and then how tension in the longer position sort of moves in line with the plane. I.e. translating in simple terms to like being stronger and longer, muscle length positions, and having, more of a tension based force that's in line with the direction of motion as opposed to, closer to perpendicular. So I thought that was a cool visual representation of it. I don't know if anything comes to mind that's interesting to you about that, but
It also emphasizes that, the eccentric component is still a contraction. Which oftentimes when I'm coaching comes up, because people think of the eccentric part as like, oh, this is where I relax, and they'll make sounds that indicate that they're relaxing, or speed will change, especially as they fatigue towards the end of a set. I notice a lot of people will just, kind of let go of the tension and maybe try to use a little bit of almost like an elastic component to the final reps. So I find it useful to spot someone and kind of just keep your hand, on the implement while they're moving, and you can literally close your eyes and sort of feel what they're doing, how they're accomplishing those final reps. And I'll often tell them, on the final eccentric reps, like, okay, I'm going to take my hand off of, the implement now. Don't let it go. Like, be able to stop it at any point. And I noticed that a lot of people on the final reps, like if I were to take my hand off of, the bar, the handle, whatever it is, like it would just slam, the weight would just slam down. And they often don't control those final eccentrics. And I think sometimes it actually has to do with how we see the representation of failure at the end of a set. I find when people can hold on to that tension, that oftentimes they can actually get more reps.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I would think it would be the opposite.
Yeah, I see much more of that representation of failure where it just like stops. When people let go of that eccentric and they're trying to use more of like, again, sort of an elastic recoil, what happens is they let go and then they just get stuck at the bottom.
Yeah. I can imagine that there would there's that kind of trade-off of like you lose having to do the work in the dropping phase, but you have to make up for it when the inertia sort of kicks in and you have to try to move out of that position again to begin with, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's probably a skill that's trainable and probably very useful in sport.
Yeah.
But in the weight room, when hypertrophy is the goal, and it's not all about just energy conservation, I think sometimes the strategies really change.
Yeah, I was talking to our mutual friend Eric recently about this concept of the different kinds of weight room training across, sport and bodybuilding, and it led us in an interesting direction because I really appreciate the framework of, contraction is contraction is contraction, and regardless of where we do it, there may be a difference in the sort of the components that make up contraction. So things that are related to force, like rate of loading, time being loaded, tempo, obviously relating to sort of rate and consistency of tempo. Do you like, where do you stand on that? Because that's not really something that you and I have personally even talked about, of like, you know there are kind of these extremes of training, like where there's the one extreme, which is like bodybuilding, which per the RTS sort of model, I like to just think about as like, this is just rehab sort of scaled up. Like that's one of the things that our friend Benny, if you remember Benny from RTS, he was talking about recently on socials, is just bodybuilding being this really scaled up version of rehab with higher volumes and greater amounts of intensity. And that's kind of like how Tom coaches people through rehab, is just the sort of like slow integration toward more quote bodybuilding type exercises. And that has its own set of issues, just labeling it that to begin with, as we've discussed. But I'm interested to hear kind of where you're at in terms of like ever thinking about possibly applying like a plyometric type of exercise prescription for, at this point, not, I can't imagine you applying a plyometric protocol to your own training, but maybe to just like, do you see it fitting in anywhere in like the training of a Gen Pop client? And then maybe, sort of why, if so, because, at this point, it's difficult for me to, you know, sort of move into that direction, mostly just because it's not really something I've spent a lot of time looking into and learning about. And so anything that I haven't learned a lot about, I don't typically feel comfortable talking about in a public forum, but then also at the very specific level of like a one-to-one session. So I personally haven't ventured in that direction of like trying to coach plyometrics because I don't have a lot of experience doing it. But I do wonder if I'm sort of missing a piece to the puzzle there with something that's a potential adaptation that can occur that maybe I am, or other people are sort of missing out with normal quote unquote bodybuilding training. So what are your thoughts on that in general, and then maybe specific application if you want to go there?
Yeah, that concept in general is something you and I have come back to a few times on our walks, where it's just like the structure of a personal training session in terms of like, what is the goal for a person who comes in who has no goals, where it's
Mhm.
just like, I want to be healthy, and then we sort of apply let's say a bodybuilding model, or maybe in the past it was applying maybe a rehab or a performance model. There's definitely a bias that we come in with based on how we train ourselves. I think largely the way that I train like general population clients has is influenced by how I train myself, but in practice the two sessions do look a bit different. But not to the degree where at this point, like I'm doing a lot of like, high velocity or plyometric type movements. So just, from a practical standpoint, where I've kind of gotten to in that regard is I think some of these things, like anything else, sort of live on this like use it or lose it principle. So like if someone is coming in, to work with me and they are currently very athletic and they are playing sports and they have been doing those type of movements, I think there might be something to, maintaining those capabilities. If you have someone who's coming in, like my typical client, where they've never done that in their whole life, and don't plan on doing anything with those type of velocity and just like abrupt force requirements, then no, I think it just comes back to specificity. when we're thinking about the adaptations that are associated with quality of life and just like healthy aging, I don't think that plyometrics are requisite to achieve any of those things. As far as like bone mass goes, muscle mass goes, cardiovascular health goes. We have talked, I think, maybe in the last episode, of just how cardiovascular performance is often limited by muscular performance and thus orthopedic health, and how important it is to maintain a sound orthopedic system through consistent muscular activity throughout a lifetime. But I don't see where starting someone on plyometrics that's coming in after a lifetime of not doing them and doesn't have any plan to do activities that resemble that, I can't make a case for that at this time.
Yeah, and I think a relevant point there too is, as you get older, you're not just, because I've heard the argument before, well, let's just say that you're someone who walks and you walk a lot. Like, why would you need to go and lift weights? And to me, the answer would be, well, the walking would sustain its own ability if you're 20 years old, 30 years old, maybe 40 or even 50 or even 60. But the older that you get, the more that you're fighting this uphill battle of just deteriorating into, a pile of mush, right? Like the more you're fighting, what's the technical term? Sarcopenia. Yeah, the more your muscles are just shriveling themselves into prunes. And so the older you get, the more likely it is that you're going to have to start to buttress that sort of negative that negative process more robustly.
And on that note, I think in general it gets a bit exaggerated how soon that happens and how much of it is driven by purely aging versus behavior.
Yeah, say more.
I think most of what we see when people are saying, oh, I'm 40 years old and I have low testosterone. I'm, 50 years old and like, I'm losing muscle, etc. I think that's largely just driven by as a consequence of what has happened in their life and the behaviors that they've maintained leading up to that. When people say, for example, like your testosterone starts to drop, in your 30s, my understanding is that's not actually true from like a physiological perspective. And I have actually seen anecdotally in a lot of my clients to support that my 60-year-old clients have like higher testosterone than any of the trainers I talk to. Like probably like once every other week on average, a trainer comes up to me and they tell me that they had a blood test and their testosterone was like somewhere between 200 and 400 usually. Like that's very common. The bias is that like maybe they wouldn't come up and tell me if they had a normal level, but it just happens very often.
More than I would think.
But yet like a lot of my guys like in their 50s and 60s, like everyone that I can think of, that's getting like, and most of them will get blood tests, let's say like annually or biannually. They usually have like, upper end reference range testosterone, and of course that can be influenced. Like some of them, may drink more or may have, more stressful lifestyles. But for the most part, like their training is not exceeding their recovery ability. Like they're not pushing their bodies too hard. They're just kind of staying in almost like a maintenance zone a lot of times. If they're people that have been training for, 10, 15 years plus, and they're not, competitive.
Yeah, which by the way, I think when people hear that, they will think that like the training of your clients looks like the typical session. And I can vouch that the way that your clients train is higher level, both I think in terms of volume and also effort than like it's not something that is comparable to the average personal training session. So when you say that, I think it's important that that's contextualized, that it is actually like harder training than the typical like Joe Schmo personal trainer at an LA Fitness or whatever, working with grandma who's like zero effort, zero intensity, those kinds of things. So they are currently I think at a point where their maintenance is above what the average person's maintenance may actually look like, just so people have a good image of what that actually is.
And I think like another anecdote outside of the research is just like you look at some of the best guys in natural bodybuilding right now, which is just going to be a bit more survivable than enhanced bodybuilding. And even enhanced bodybuilding, we have guys in their 40s that are at the top of the sport, but in natural bodybuilding, you have guys in their 50s that are still competing, doing really well, and still actually making some progress.
Yeah.
So it's very slow, and we've talked about before with the type clientele that I mainly work with, that at a certain point, like the juice might not be worth the squeeze as far as trying to push the envelope. And it may be more about kind of maintaining certain aspects while focusing on other areas, of life or other sort of benefits that you get out of training. But if your goal is to eke out, an extra, tenth of a percentage point over, a couple years, it does seem that, in a stage lean physique, people are still improving, in their 40s and 50s. So, on that point of kind of use it or lose it, it ultimately depends, like, where are you coming from? How much were you doing before? Are you comparing yourself, like I have guys, as that were like former Olympic athletes, and now they're on to something else. And it's like, well, are you comparing yourself to, when you were training at those volumes for the Olympics and now you're, not in that kind of shape because you're older? Or is it simply just, not doing those behaviors anymore? And I think we just underestimate, as a general statement, how much of that is driven by behavior versus how much is driven purely by the aging process.
I've always thought about what it would be like to just, because I can't imagine that, if you and I lift the way that, and there will be obvious differences between you lifting now and you lifting in 30 years versus me, just in terms of like the amount of volume and how much you're eating and all those things. But aside from that, like I can't really imagine myself 30 years from now not still lifting. And I just wonder, is there ever a point where of course so many different things could change, but what is the point at which people don't feel able to do that anymore? Because I feel like as long as you're doing whatever is within your capacity on the given day, like it feels like there's always something to do, so like I would like to be the 80-year-old that's like still going to the gym. Like it sounds crazy. But I think it's possible. And you see people doing it. Like you see videos. I don't know if you see the videos, but there are videos all the time of like people who are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, like deadlifting.
Who's over 100 pounds, like and he's over 100 years old. That's that goes up every day and works out.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that's the goal. That's the end goal for me. Your end goal at the moment is a little bit more near term. Mine's like, I want to lift until I die currently.
You want to peak at it's
yeah.
like the ultimate master's class. Like you've just outlived everybody, that's lifting.
Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
kind of like, you see that a little bit in the NPC now, like in the masters nationals and stuff. They'll have like, the over 60 class, over 70 class. And it's like, there's only one guy left, so he gets his pro card. And that, like me and one of my buddies who's a bodybuilder, we kind of joke that like, that's the way he's gonna, turn pro eventually. Outlast everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that in terms of, first of all, I mean, I think that's cool. I think, I've seen videos of like those kinds of guys online, and, the internet is so aggressive sometimes. Like here's this guy who's just having fun. He's on stage, he's doing his thing. He looks better than 99.9% of people his age. And people are like shitting on him. They're like, this isn't bodybuilding. This is fucked up. This is stupid. Like, who would let this happen? Yeah. And like, to some degree, I understand, you care about the sport, you're invested, it's more of an art to you, and it feels like this disrespectful gesture that's being made and plastered as this sort of like moral pandering. You know, I can see that side of the argument, but then again, it's like, who cares, man? Just let them. The same thing happened recently with Ian Valier, with him just like losing a bunch of weight and now still looking like someone who is more muscular than 99% of 99.9% of the entire world. He's like this 0.1% person still. And people are like, skinny bitch, like so small. Like, motherfucker. Let's relax. So the bodybuilding world, especially, I'm glad that I'm not really into the social media bodybuilding world super deep. It gets bad. Like YouTube is better than Instagram, but I'm happy I haven't fallen into that trap at this point, as I'm sure you will not. So even in the case, it's like, you know, we're at the New York Pro in May, April, whenever that happens to be. I think if people are asking for your Instagram, we can give it to them, but you will not have to you will not have to incur the risk of that exchange. So you can be rest assured of that. Okay, so we started out by talking about the muscle comparison thing, and then concentric, eccentric. I think one of the points that I wanted to make in relationship to that we briefly discussed this week was that concept of like control. You know, because I like the framework of, you know, well, letting go of the eccentric and not really controlling it is sort of like an energy conservation strategy. At least, you know, at least I think we can put it that way simply. And actively resisting against the resistance while still allowing it to move, you know, in the direction that you're not actually pushing. That's not necessarily like an easy task. You know, it's like it's kind of a weird thing to conceptualize. And, you know, you can feel this very clearly. I don't know if you've ever used an implement like a flywheel. You ever used one of those?
Yeah.
Yeah. Those things are super cool. And for those of you who don't know what it is, it's basically, I don't know what the exact mechanism is, but you push against it as hard as you can, and it pushes back against you, and you get to the end of the range, and it basically is actively pulling you. So if you do let go of any of it, it basically just like flies at a super high velocity. And so you're basically forced to consistently push against the handle or the strap or whatever you're pushing against. And you get really immediate feedback doing that. But like the problem with dumbbells, or not necessarily the problem, but the trade-off of dumbbells and the trade-off of cables is that they're not like actively, you know, making sure that you're doing that in the same way. So I think if we could make a definition of like what control is, it would be that you maintain an ability to push in the opposite direction to the resistance, regardless of which direction that you're moving. And the second that you're not doing it, by definition, you know that something else is moving the resistance, usually some, you know, form of gravity, hopefully, and that you're not under control. The issue with this is that I think a lot of times when people move in that direction, there's like a little bit of an overcorrection where if I don't control every single portion of every single centimeter of this motion, now it's like it's going to be a waste of time, or my joints are going to explode. And striking that balance, I think, is a little bit difficult to do sometimes with clients, and even sometimes myself. It's like how much time should I generally spend on like an eccentric, depending on the motion. You know, obviously motions have different amounts of range, but insofar as like tempo for eccentrics, do you have any sort of go-to or practical recommendations around time frame or tips in relationship to the concept of control, outside of just the things that I've sort of broad scopes mentioned?
The first thing that comes to mind is what I said earlier, which is that like I want you to be able to stop it if I say stop. So like you're, let's say, descending into an eccentric squat, leg extension, what have you. You know, if you were aware that, you know, I was going to give you this cue, where when I say stop, you have to hold the weight. I think that's generally the level of control that I'm looking for. Now, to your point about like practicing, like any other skill, one of the things that is going to ingrain a motor pattern is being able to do it under higher and higher velocities, right? Like you can add, levels of complexity to it. And one thing that you might do as a progression with a skill is do it faster. It doesn't matter what that thing is. Could be playing a piano, could be doing a leg extension. But the same could still hold true when you're moving it fast. At any point, do you have enough control where you could stop it and hold it there? And I think as a general concept, that's like the first thing that comes to mind is I want you to have enough control where you could stop if you needed to.
Yeah, and I think isometrics are pretty good for that as well. Like not in the sense that pausing in between sorry, not in the sense that like you're doing sets where you're just holding isometrics as in a plank or as in, like some kind of dead bug hold, whatever motion, but just in the sense that taking the end ranges as opportunities to check in with that degree of control. I see that as it currently stands, I see that being a very sensible trade-off of like, well, we could pause, in the short position of everything, assuming there's load there, and we could pause in the length of position and kind of check in and make sure we own these things and lose a little bit of that, velocity and potentially force in something like a lengthened position, which may be a benefit. I would take that trade-off over the occasional sort of sloppy, set. So even if I'm using, and I think you employ this tactic fairly regularly now, where you will intentionally sort of take more time, not only in the midst of like an eccentric, but also at, end ranges, pausing in the shore, pausing in the lengthen as a strategy to kind of decrease, absolute load, which I think, to be honest, I think is always a trade-off that makes sense to me. I don't really know if you can justify based on whatever you might perceive the outcome to be that like using more load at higher, slightly uncontrolled velocities is a sensible trade-off. I think that it's something that you can move in the direction of if you find that you are stagnating because you are overly analytical and hesitant about every single rep that you do on every single set. I think that's also a problem, but I also don't really find that that's often the problem that people have. Like 99 times out of 100, it's going to be the inverse of that problem, which is that there's no degree of control. There's no sense of which direction am I moving. There's no sense of am I actually moving this weight or is it moving me? It's usually the alternative. So I think in terms of tempo, I don't think that there's like a set number or amount of seconds that people should subscribe to, because in some sense, I actually think that takes away from the focus of what you're trying to do in the first place. Because if you just name an arbitrary amount of time, sure, it may be better than what was initially happening because at least you're bringing some awareness to it. But at the end of the day, you don't want to get stuck there because that's not really the point of actually bringing your attention to it in the first place. The point is the control. It's not the amount of seconds, that you're using. I'll see people prescribing like 5-second eccentrics on a biceps curl. First of all, it's like, it's not even 5 seconds, it's like a quarter of that time usually. But like I said, some awareness is probably better than no awareness. So the other thing I wanted to just touch on today, I don't know if you're aware, but I have a newsletter. Newsletter has been gaining traction over time, and I usually send 1 or 2 emails a week. It's usually just like as much for me as it is the potential reader, where I often just write about topics that I'm thinking about and want to clarify my thoughts on. And some of the topics are obviously I have to limit complexity to some degree because I want a majority of people to be able to understand it, like first read type of a thing. And one of the things that I was breaking down recently was just like previous quote unquote lifting mistakes, just things that I look back on that I used to do that I now no longer do for specific reasons because I think that there are better alternatives. And I was kind of interested to hear some of the initial things that pop up for you when it comes to that. I think the concept of, the lifting mistake is not like, it sounds inherently bad, like, oh, don't do these things. I think a lot of people need to actually learn through experience, because, all these things at the end of the day are contextual and individual. And for me, one of the biggest things that I changed my mind on before I sort of had like the intellectual awakening around lifting was just, I always thought that I needed to do certain things, which is kind of why I ended up, pursuing powerlifting just as a hobby for some time, is because I felt like those were the things that you needed to do to be fit and strong. And I think that's why I have sort of moved in the direction so far opposite from it, is because I had so many negative experiences as a consequence of just continually subscribing to that belief system for so long, and I think that that's something that as a trainer, if you don't sort of pay attention to and check in on, you can start to impose on your clients. And I think we see that happening a lot, where trainers who are emotionally tied to certain systems and methods at the cost of their clients' potential success or greater amount of progress apply the same methods when they have there's no sense in actually applying them. So anyway, I kind of was just interested to hear anything that comes to mind in relationship to your training, where, whether it was a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, what are some of the things that you look back on and, would make a conscious effort with a new client, maybe who was getting into bodybuilding, what would some of those things be that you would make a clear point of saying like, hey, not necessarily let's avoid this, but just like, let's be careful about potentially going down this rabbit hole or in this direction, for fear of your previous experience recurring.
Yeah. So in no particular order, I'll just think of things that, may have come up recently with clients. Usually with this type stuff, I'll just think of something that like happened yesterday. Like when we were talking about the range of motion, eccentric control, like I was literally just visualizing a session that I did yesterday where that was relevant, because that's about as far as my memory goes back.
Sure.
Steroids make you dumber. I heard that on a podcast.
Yeah, I it hasn't been I haven't observed that.
Yeah, I don't know how much evidence strongly supports that. It's almost like, a lot of guys don't do their blood work for like fear of finding out something they don't but like, in the same respect, it's almost like I don't want to, if I don't almost don't want to research that topic, because it's like, all right, it's something I'm going to do anyway, so I don't want to like placebo myself, into thinking, or sort of nocebo in this.
Yeah. I can also say that it seems, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be a correlation between your amount of steroid use and your intelligence. It seems like there's a direct relationship more than an inverse relationship. Don't you feel like you've gotten smarter over the last, I don't know, 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's not fair. It's just kind of like more, more exposure, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying that's the evidence that we have at hand. So that's what we can go off of for now.
And it's also, alleged steroid use, right?
Right, alleged, yeah.
No one's actually seen it in person.
No. No one listening.
All right. So yesterday, mistake. So oftentimes, like the sort of archetype of a person who gets into bodybuilding and is good at it is someone who really desires structure, and someone who is just looking to sort of control their environment and systematically implement changes that result in progress over time. There was actually like a research study that came out recently looking at sort of like interviews, like qualitative research of bodybuilders, and just sort of laying out this like archetypal mindset of a bodybuilder, which is really interesting. Eric mentioned it in a recent podcast, I think on 3DMJ or maybe Iron Culture, but good one to check out. I think it's in Mass as well. Anyway, so you have like a certain personality type that tends to get into bodybuilding that's, successful at it. And when you're looking at that qualitative research, there's also this bias, like a survivorship bias of like the people that you're interviewing, made it in body or are still doing bodybuilding. They haven't quit yet. So, you're only really looking at the people who have been, at least quasi successful, like in maintaining that behavior. So when you have people that really like to, follow the structured routine, feel in control, and, want to be able to, sort of see and visualize like the changes that they're making, happen in real time. It's easy to lose sight of like the subjective experience in the moment. And you may come up with this like really great plan, and you may have an idea of like, these are the exercises that I should do. And like, this is the weight that I did last week, and, tempo, whatever you mentioned tempo a moment ago, and just like how this idea of prescribing a tempo can actually get away from the quality of doing it in the moment, right? And I think we see that a lot, and that's kind of my stance on failure. Is I think much like counting your tempo, counting your reps and having a desired outcome, I also think has some impact on the quality in which you do that. And I think the more you can focus on just each individual rep, being as good as possible, and just letting the outcome sort of be what the outcome is. I think, that as a principle is really something that I've had to mature into. And I still see it come up all the time, where it's like, oh, I put together, even this past week, like starting, a new off-season block after coming off of, a week's vacation. It was like, oh man, I spent all this time on the train, like laying out this plan of how much I was going to eat. And like, these are the exercises. This is the weight that I'm going to start at. And then it can be tough to make that transition to like, ooh, I'm gaining weight, a little too rapidly, or this exercise didn't feel good. And, realizing that you have options, and that you don't need to be dogmatic to what you thought was going to happen, but you need to respond to the reality of what is happening and what you are feeling. And the other thing, about being a good bodybuilder is you have to almost, enjoy this process of overcoming discomfort. And that sort of becomes an identity as someone who can just, tolerate high levels of discomfort, someone, who can stick to a plan, even in the face of, a lot of potential pain, a lot of potential, people use the word sacrifice, but just in the face of a changing environment, you're able to, stick to what you said you were going to do, and, be able to, execute on the plan. And getting really good at that over time sometimes, I think, gets in the way of your ability to sort of feel what's happening moment to moment. And I think that's a more mature skill that you can sort of learn to utilize with time. And I think what you see in a lot of the best bodybuilders is they're not necessarily relishing in this concept of like, I'm the toughest, I know how to suffer the most. It's really just like, only apply the amount needed to get the job done. Any more than that, is sort of wasted effort. And it's not about showing people that you can put in the most effort. I think a lot of times the person who is not successful, has to sort of like take that on as an identity. Is like, the identity is how hard I work, because, the result isn't indicative of it. So really it's going to be more about like, I'm second place, or, I'm not turning pro, or whatever it is. Like, the identity becomes now around intellect, or the identity becomes around effort. But you don't necessarily always see that with the champion, right? Like if you see Jordan, smoking a cigar and, gambling and, the off season, and just kind of like being able to really like shut it off. A lot of times that's representative of the champion, is the person who's, able to turn it on when they need to, able to sort of sense, what their limits are. And I think in order to find those limits, a lot of times you do have to have that extreme personality of wanting to find the edge. But, in time, in maturity, you only really pull that out when you need to. And I think that's something that, just constantly comes back to me, is that kind of like balance between, all right, this is the time where you need to push harder. And this is like the reality of what's happening in the moment, and knowing sort of what your limitations are, and, when to pull back.
It's interesting how you kind of see this represented at multiple different levels and in across fields. Like, so for me personally, that's something that I have a felt sense of with a lot of the, studying that I do, where it was like, at first I took on this identity of like, I want to be the smartest person in the room. And so I'm going to do something structured every day. I have this course, I have these videos I'm going to watch on this day and this day and this day. And eventually you actually get to a point where that is the thing that is limiting your ability to be more creative and sort of form your own person and your own strategy and your own persona. In a sense, not persona in like a fake way, but like in an actual, like you are sort of coming into yourself sort of a way, right? And you create these sort of these like artificial, or not artificial, but you create these barriers that you're not even aware sort of exist, right? Because you're caught in the structure. So it's interesting how the complete novice and the person who's the most advanced, they almost do similar things, but for completely opposite reasons, right? Like the person who is just starting out may not appear to have the structure. They may appear to just do anything on any given day. And there may be some examples of that, like at the extreme of the high performance end, but it's always for a much more, it's always for a reason that's based in some kind of wisdom or some kind of, previous learned experience. So I think that as a concept is super interesting. I'm curious in this particular case, because you said that you were having this conversation with a client. How did you explain that at a level that was what I would guess would be a little bit lower level than how you just explained it?
Yeah, someone was just telling me that they were, this was like more of a consult, not someone that I was just training every day.
Okay.
We're just saying that, like, I'm having elbow pain, with certain exercises, and I know I wasn't going to get a chance to look at these exercises, in this session, in this consult. So I was just trying to get the point across that, like, you don't have to do, any particular exercise, right? That, like, if you notice you're feeling a certain thing, don't feel obliged to stick to whatever plan you have written and say, okay, these are the exercises that I had planned. These are the exercises that I've been told, are the best. Like, you have so many options, in the limited specificity that's required for bodybuilding. And that's something that actually just takes practice to realize. We're just like, oh, I can, do a different exercise order. Like, I can use BFR. Like, there are just, it definitely takes a certain level of knowledge to know what those options are. But I think one of the interesting things that's sort of like come out of the research in more recent years is like a focus, or at least like not even, it wasn't even a focus like they were trying to find this, but I just think with a lot of research they're finding like, oh, a lot of things work. Like, there's a lot of roads to Rome. Like, a lot of these, like, a lot of people going into exercise science, started off reading the muscle magazines. A lot of times nowadays they're like natural bodybuilders, so there's all this research being done on like the optimal way to train for hypertrophy, which just doesn't even matter to like 99% of the population. But sometimes out of that research, what you find is that, like, oh, we still don't really know what optimal is, but we know there's a lot of roads to Rome, and all of these things, seem to work just as well. Or sometimes you find like, well, if I use less load, that works as well as higher load. And there's ways, to be time efficient. Maybe we do less sets with higher effort. There's, ways to sort of work around injuries. Like, there's not magical exercises, and it just empowers people. The more and more they recognize that, the more and more maybe they go through the experience of taking a week off, and it takes very little time for them, to make back that progress. That's another one where it's like looking at anything in sort of the quasi deloading literature where it's like, okay, one group trains for, this many months straight, another group does it, but then also takes time off, or they take a week off in between. And you're just like, wow, they're getting like, pretty much equal results, even when one group's taking time off. So you find that like there's options and you don't have to be, quite as like dogmatic as, maybe we once thought. And you would think that as more and more research came out, we would become more and more dogmatic. And in fact, it's very much been the opposite in regards to hypertrophy. So, you can stress that to people over and over again, but I also know just through my own experience, like you do kind of have to live it. Like you do have to realize like, oh, if I take this time off, I'm fine. Or if I switch exercises, like you can't really tell the difference, or rep ranges or whatever, you know. So it was just kind of emphasizing like, in this particular case, I said, I'm like, and he'll know because I'm sure he's will listen to this podcast at some point. Um, but when a client says to you like, oh, I slept on it wrong, and now it hurts this morning, or just as common, I'm sure for you, is when I'm doing my warm-up sets, it hurts, but once I like, kind of get into it, it feels better. Um, I'm personally not, a fan of that anecdote. For me to be like, all right, well, yeah, if it feels better, once you warm up, just like warm up. I would personally just, through experience, and some of these things, I feel like are kind of debated at this point. But when you're coaching people, you just find like, man, eventually, if you just play that out long enough, it usually doesn't go well. I find it similar in kind of the range of motion conversation we are having earlier. Like a lot of times when people have discomfort and they're just, relaxing into the eccentric, or, not like allowing the weight to sort of push them back further than they can control. Oftentimes if a person's, not able to sort of feel a muscle working, or if they're having, discomfort in a given joint, that often changes their experience, just more control. And I do find in this example as well, like I'm not comfortable with the idea of, consistently a person having that experience of, yeah, if I just like warm up, then I feel better. Because then it's just more and more and more. It's like, there was a period where it was, if I just foam roll and I do these exercises beforehand, then I feel good enough, to do my training. Or if I just do a few warm up sets, or, go a little bit lighter, knowing that we have so many options, even if it didn't matter, I would still err on the side of caution and say, well, we have a lot of options, so let's find something, that does work. And to my point earlier, it does take some knowledge to realize, or to recognize like what options you do have, because it isn't easy to necessarily know like, well, this, sort of joint angle is bothering me, this direction of loading, whatever it is, and then be able to sort of see that for what it is. But I would at least encourage people to experiment. And some things are very obvious. Like, if your elbow is bothering you on a press and you have an opportunity to, do a pec deck where it's, loaded at the, the elbow or the humerus, that's a really simple way to just, take stress off of your elbow. And I would just encourage, people listening to like get creative. And, if your goal is hypertrophy, realize that like, you have options, and choosing the one that is clearly uncomfortable just for the sake of like, meeting the logbook, in my experience, not a good long-term strategy.
Yeah, and just for whatever it's worth, that concept of warming up and something hurting, and then just it feeling better, like when there's a lot of load or more load. I think the way that I would I would tend to agree that that's not an anecdote that I love. I think that at the lower levels, if anything, there should be less discomfort, and if there's going to be, it should be the thing that manifests when there's more load. So if you see the inverse of that, it's kind of like, you know that there's been this sort of like physiological band-aid that's just moved the discomfort below your level of perception. And so I think that, and this is how you, like you said, is how you start branching into other warm-ups. It's like, oh, this thing that was warming me up before and getting rid of the discomfort, that worked for a little bit, but like now it's no longer enough, to get me sympathetic enough to forget about this discomfort. So I tend to agree. I also think that there is a distinction to be made there, just somewhat off topic, but there's a difference between feeling like you're warming up and feeling discomfort, because warming up is not always like the most comfortable. Like you feel stiff, maybe, you need to grease the groove a little bit. That's, maybe you do 2 sets at the same weight. I discovered that that's a thing that you can do in the last, year. I was just like, was programmed like, oh, just move the pin down, that's how a warm up works. But then, it sounds kind of silly, but you would often do like, yeah, that warm up didn't feel like totally good. Like, I'm just going to do another one at the same weight. Like, and I think that's a good way to sort of look at it, like in those kinds of steps. So, yeah, I think that's a good.
Off of that, actually.
Go ahead.
One, what you just said about kind of like auto-regulating the warm-ups by feel. One thing that I've done on that note of sort of like maturing and being able to, have a better internal sense of what's happening in real time is when I'm programming now, whether it be, diet, training, whatnot, at the end of a phase, at the beginning of a phase, I can sort of dial the level of, effort that I want to give. And, we have talked a lot about this idea of like arousal and just like really how there are sort of like minute differences in how much effort you can apply, which can make a big difference, in your output and just the level of, intensity you're approaching the session at. And I think coming into like a new block, you can have very distinct changes in like, volume and say like the loads that you use. But you can also come into a new block with the mindset of just like exploration. And I think, a mature athlete, even, who has who should have, a plan on paper and sort of, a broad generalized path forward sort of in pencil, that you can actually dial a lot of things up and down just with sort of a tuning of your mindset. And the mindset just kind of tunes everything. So for example, like going into prep, right now I'm coming up on 24 weeks out. And in the past, when I would start prep, it's kind of like, this is the start, X amount of weeks out, it's 100%. And that was kind of the mindset. And it's like, to do that, for 20 weeks on end is extremely fatiguing just in and of itself.
Like, you just mean in terms of like it being psychologically taxing to begin with.
Just deciding I'm going to do everything at 100%. There's no room for deviation from that. Even many times you can get the same output where it's just telling yourself like, this is war, like this is, and you hear this again, a lot of people that are successful at this type of endeavor start with that mindset, whether they started bodybuilding in their teens or they started, in their 30s or 40s. The initial stages are like, this is something, the identity is I'm a warrior, oftentimes. Whereas, being able to tune that over time is really helpful, because I think so much of the fatigue that comes out of this process is just how you're approaching it mindset wise. So, like we talk about with learning anything new, whether it be your eccentric tempo, where when someone's learning it to slow down the first time, it's kind of choppy, it's extra slow. Same thing here. Like, it may be, it used to be that I would write down like, all right, I'm not going to start taking caffeine, before training until, X amount of weeks into the block. And I would like, restrict myself from certain behaviors, or I'm going to, listen to, start like listening to music and like, pumping myself up, but not kind of allow myself to do that, too early on. And those things, were things that sort of consciously came up as I realized over time just like how long you could sustain, 100% push for. And I've just found more and more examples, like, how much time are you spending by yourself? Because eventually, like, if you are going to be, doing this, 24/7, it's just no one's going to be with you the whole day. You're going to have to practice posing by yourself. You're going to have to do cardio by yourself. You're going to have training sessions by yourself. And I do think there is, for, obviously it varies between people, but you sort of need to know, like, you sort of get to know intuitively over time, just like how much, time is appropriate for me to be able to spend in that bubble, just in your own head. And I think it's easy to overshoot early on, just how quickly you go into that bubble and how quickly you restrict things that aren't necessary in order to achieve the goal. So whether that be sort of a more like auto-regulated eating approach earlier on, where you're just a little bit looser and you're like, there's going to be some, like, if it fits your macros going on, where it's like, yeah, later on in prep, it's almost easier in many ways to not think and just, eat exactly the same thing to hit the macros every time. But earlier on in prep, maybe you allow yourself, like, there's a meal out per week and you're making more of a conscious effort, like, to be social and to just feel normal. And you realize over time that, like, if you just start from a reasonable place, like, you can be normal for a lot longer than you thought. So bringing that back, to most people, who aren't necessarily going through a prep, I think starting a training block is much in the same way. It's just, how do you approach it? Do you approach it as day one, here we go, like we're starting something, or do you allow yourself, emotionally to ease into it, to take the plane off, gradually, and allow yourself, maybe early on, it could be as simple as just saying, like, I'm going to experiment with things. Like, you have a loose plan, but you allow yourself to play. You go into the gym and just find new things. It could be you go to a new gym, that could change your experience, a new training partner, new exercises, whatever it is. Like, allowing a person who, would naturally be good at this, who maybe is very linear, very dogmatic, like who's going to have a bias towards structure, maybe just allowing yourself a little bit of an unstructured environment where you get to experiment, you get to learn new things. And I found that very enjoyable as time has gone on, just realizing, like, how sort of randomness, can lead to new discoveries, where I find a new way to do an exercise that just came out of, like, something totally unexpected. Someone was doing a chest press in front of me the other day, like in between sets, when I was doing a lateral raise on the cable. And I just had to put my foot, on the bench in between sets, because it was, right in front of where I was standing. And I was like, "Ooh, this is a really cool way to manipulate the profile of this lateral raise. So I can kind of lean forward. It's getting heavier lengthen. And then I can literally use this as kind of like a foot pedal to sort of push myself back. So then, I'm not going to roll the bench up every time, but I put a wedge there. It was like, oh, now I have this foot pedal to sort of push me backwards, and my whole body just moves as a unit, and the profile drops off really nicely. And just do that, more and more as I fatigue. So there's so many examples of that. It's like every new exercise variation that I've come up with has just been out of, like, being open enough to experiment and to just, solve things that may have not been apparent if, number one, I wasn't open to the idea of there's many roads to Rome, and two, wasn't so locked into an approach and a mindset of, like, this is the plan, this is the goal, and we're starting today.
Yeah, and like we were talking about earlier, I find it very interesting that you see that pattern across not just the specific journey that you're describing, but also across a ton of fields. Like, you see it in people like Tom, for example, now, who's just is constantly like, I don't know, like, let's just be creative and see how this goes, or like, let's find this new thing. And I think it's a representation of that general timeline, when, that the timeline to competency is kind of like maybe a decent way to describe it. But at first it's kind of like all chaos and, you know, trying to figure shit out. And at some point you move toward like more organization and order, and then you get too rigid and being orderly. And then you find the blend between enough of that chaos and like creativity, and then enough of the organization and the order. And I think that that's obviously, you know, your proof in the pudding, as are many others. But I also think that there's a certain percentage of people, myself included, who hear stuff and don't believe stuff until there's an experience. I think that's maybe at some level the only way that you can actually understand it is the experience of it. But there will be a certain number of people who hear it and actually dig deeper into wherever they're currently digging. And I think sort of just need to sort of run into a wall to be able to be like, oh, that's what Ethan was talking about, you know, that kind of a thing. So I do wonder what kind of where the population is insofar as the people who listen to this podcast, like where they fall on that distribution. I would be willing to bet it's more like oh, I can conceptualize that kind of a thing, but like I'm still going to do this thing anyway because it's currently what's working, and that's also fine. I think too. I think that's normal, and that's also part of what needs to happen for you to actually become whatever, you know, you are individually capable of becoming and moving toward. Anything else on that? Anything else that you wanted to mention? Just that final thought.
I would hope that people do that, you know, because that just leads, you know, to things like this, where it's like you do have different experiences, and people can, you know, when people are able to take their own route via, you know, their unique experiences, that's how we learn. So I think that's, you know, part of the fun, and I would hope, you know, that people do that. Um, this is like, you know, just sort of harking back to a topic earlier, but that topic of the eccentric control and tempo, you know, we had Hector on the show earlier, you know, in this podcast, and one of the things he brought up to me in the gym the other day, and I don't know if he mentioned this to you, but he was saying like when he's doing RDLs, you know, he's typically using the Kaiser, and recently, you know, he's been training at a different gym, and sometimes he'll use iron. You know, so for people who aren't familiar with the Kaiser uses pneumatic resistance or air pressure. And that air pressure both, you know, resists the concentric and the eccentric. You know, and did he mention this to you?
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to hear, you know, if we had different takes on the topic.
Mm.
So, you know, the first thing that I said is, well, just fundamentally, when I think about the difference between, you know, the pneumatic resistance and the iron, you know, it comes down to, you know, sort of dampening the inertial effects, you know, much like you talk about with the pulley systems, and, you know, how far the cable moves relative to, you know, how far you move the cable relative to how far the weight stack moves, can influence how heavy it is, you know, in your hand, and you know, ultimately like how much, you know, momentum you can generate. And then Dennis Kaiser's idea was like, let's, you know, circumvent all of that, let's use air, so you can never really generate momentum. So there's always going to be some mass involved, because ultimately there's a handle or there's a bar attached to it. But as the bar gets lighter, the handle gets lighter, you have less and less mass involved. And this equation of force equals mass times acceleration is really more influenced by the acceleration component, because there's no weight really to the implement you're using. It's just the air pressure, which generates actually more of like an accelerative force. So the two places you see this are, you know, if you want to see the representation of different pulley systems and how that sort of influences inertia, you can take the handle and you can try to move it really quickly. And what you'll see with like a 1-to-1 stack versus like a 4-to-1 is just that as you try to you know, accelerate the load, that the cable stack will at some point become weightless if you move it fast enough. And then as you move to air, what you'll find is no matter how little air that you use, you can never get to the point where it becomes weightless. It's always pushing back against you. And if you were to say pull a cable out with, you know, 1 pound of resistance, versus 50 pounds of resistance from the air, that unlike a 1 pound dumbbell and a 50-pound dumbbell, which will fall at the same speed, 1 pound of air resistance and 50 pounds of air resistance will not. And anyone who's dropped a cable from a Kaiser rack, or a pulley, will know that it heavy weight there will rapidly accelerate and often damage the machine if there's a lot.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things that came to mind. One was the transition process of coming out of the bottom of the RDL, and just how those inertial effects impact the degree of torque, like on a spine that is in a more flexed position at the bottom of the RDL. So that was the first thing that came to mind, is just like, what type of force do you need to produce to be able to change directions at the bottom of the RDL, and how might that impact spinal loading when you have the longest moment arm there to the spine. The other thing that came to mind is just, what do you need, how do you organize yourself against a load that is against a force that is accelerating you towards the earth, and a force that never really that is always giving you feedback. So many people have experienced what it's like to put a band on a machine, and how a band that is resisting your concentric feels as if it's always sort of crushing you down towards the ground. Similar experience with Kaiser, where it just never leaves your hand, or never leaves wherever it's contacting your body. You have this constant feedback of something pushing back against you, and how that may impact how you organize yourself, how you brace, and how you sense where you are in space. So those were sort of two things that came to mind. And also this idea of control, and how that might impact the perception of pain. That is one where you could do the same exercise potentially under different types of loading, and might have a very different experience. So
Yeah.
just to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah. So that's essentially what I said to Hector, was just the general concept of inertia, and the description of the differences in inertial effects, and pretty much everything you said in much simpler but also not as nuanced terms. And I think that a good visual representation, just for people who are listening who maybe weren't familiar with some of the concepts that you kind of threw in there, the biggest difference that you would see if you were using 100% air versus 100% iron is, if you were using 100% air and you attempted to move toward the floor quickly, and you sort of did that letting go thing, you would be tugged toward the floor like rapidly. Like there would be, like, you along with the bar would be sort of like accelerated toward the ground. But with the weight, like if you were to sort of just or not, like if you were to imagine you just dropping the bar rather than you moving down with it, that's a better way to describe it. If you just let go of the air, much like a resistance band, would just like snap it to the floor. But if you drop the iron, like you were describing with the 1 pound versus the 50-pound dumbbell, right, it's just going to fall as something that would be free weight would fall, with that consistent acceleration. So what that encourages is, it encourages, much like with that flywheel example, is it always encourages you to be acting in the opposite direction relative to the load, because if you don't, like, you just are going to accelerate at a rate that is not only probably eventually uncomfortable, but also looks quite weird. But that also doesn't stop people sometimes in hype from doing shit that looks weird. But yeah, no, you hit all the major points there. The only other thing that, and this is probably very minor, that I could even think of in that instance, is the pulleys on the Kaiser machine are not technically static, and they can move. So there may actually be, depending on, if you I would be very curious to see, like, an RDL done with the free weight versus the Kaiser, like how if if at all, how the load direction changes with the sort of ability for those pulleys to shift back and forward. Because I would imagine, that it would be quite subtle, but that also, if you're using hundreds of pounds, that subtle difference in distance can actually make a pretty significant difference, even if you're just at the top of the motion, how that thing is potentially pulling, especially if you're accelerating and decelerating at a rapid rate. So, I think it's a really good way to bring awareness to the Kaiser stuff. It's a good way to bring awareness to sort of force control, because there are immediate consequences to you not doing that in the actual physical motion of whatever implement you're using, versus the consequences with a free weight kind of implement is like you just having to incur or deal with all of that force that you're sort of not really seeing moving much quicker, because all of it is just going into you. It's not, necessarily going into the bar. So the starts and the stops with the free weight RDL, even when you get to the top of an RDL, if you are accelerating the load upward, there's going to be some degree of like it sort of dropping, even if it's very subtle. So yeah, I think that overall, I really like the Kaiser for that. It's unfortunate that a lot of their machines are not built super biomechanically friendly, but that also hasn't really stopped us from using and modifying them. And there are some pieces that work really well. I also tend to think that that's why there's sort of a flip side to it, where even if people blow past the ability to control those things, there is that rapid acceleration that happens, and people can maybe get some degree of discomfort because there's just this like much quicker acceleration. But for the most part, I would say that all those points were covered and heard. I would say maybe just from a practical standpoint, because not a lot of people are ever going to have access to Kaiser or even know what Kaiser is or see a Kaiser machine, that with something like a free weight RDL, the solution to this problem to me isn't to just try to use implements everywhere that force you to use that kind of control. Like I'm not gonna have someone do a banded RDL, I'm not gonna ban them in the direction that the load is pulling them. But I think that's why something like a reverse band, even on something like a Smith machine press, can actually bring some degree of awareness. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone do this, where they anchor the band to the top of the rack and they'll actually loop it around the bar. So there's a greater awareness. Same thing with the pendulum squat, like reverse banding that. That's the purpose of like a reverse band type of thing, is to actually get you to, in those situations, have some degree of awareness of like how fast you're moving and whether or not you're actually controlling, the implement that you're using. Because I think a lot of people just assume that you have to ban things in the concentric direction, but that is really the biggest benefit, aside from the potential resistance profile change, which you can kind of lump hand in hand. And I also think that's why people just like to use bands in general, just because like they tend not to hurt as much from a joint perspective. But that doesn't mean it's the band that is magical. It just means that you are changing your execution as a response to the property of the band that would otherwise, make you do something that looks silly. So I think that's a good place to pause. I would like to continue some aspects of this discussion moving forward, especially some of the prior mistakes and what else maybe you have to say on that topic, if anything else comes up over the course of the next week or so. But I'm excited to also be continuing the podcast through your prep, because it'll be interesting to kind of see what comes up and we can talk about it, and maybe it will be helpful to any prospective bodybuilders, because I know we have a good amount of those who listen to the podcast who are interested in this kind of journey. So I think we can do, in every week at some point, update of like, hey, how was this week? What happened? What was different? So it'll kind of almost be like a documentation, an accidental documentation. Well, now it's not really accidental because I'm talking about it, but it's gonna be a documentation where someone following you around would be less practical. So I think that'll be interesting. All right, till next week.